What if I told you that the deadliest pandemic in human history made some people unbelievably rich? That while tens of millions were dying across Europe, while entire cities were collapsing, and while economies were tearing apart, a small group of merchants, nobles, and even peasants were quietly building fortunes that would reshape the world for centuries. Because the Black Plague didn't just destroy societies, it rearranged power. It broke the old economic order and created new winners no one expected. So the real mystery isn't how the world collapsed in the 14th century. It's this: who got rich because of the Black Plague? And why does a similar pattern happen after almost every major global crisis even today? Let's dive in. To understand who got rich, you need to know what the world looked like right before the plague hit. Europe in the early 1300s was rigid, slow, and tightly controlled. A world where kings and nobles owned nearly everything. Peasants worked the same lands generation after generation. Wages were low and fixed, and social mobility was almost impossible. If you were born poor, you died poor. The medieval economy was built on feudalism, a system where land meant power. But land is worthless without labor, and peasants were locked into working fields owned by nobles. The rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and almost no one moved up the ladder. But this entire structure relied on one thing: people. Lots of them. More workers meant more food, lower wages, and stable power for the elite. So when a deadly new disease slipped into Europe along the trade routes in 1347, no one realized the economic world was about to be flipped upside down. The Black Plague likely started in Central Asia, carried by fleas living on rats that traveled on merchant ships. By the time infected ships reached Sicily, it was already too late. Within weeks, whole villages vanished. Clergymen died faster than they could bury the dead, and the economy simply froze. By 1351, the plague had killed 1 out of every 3 Europeans. Imagine that today too. 6 billion people gone in 4 years. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was an economic earthquake. And as the old order collapsed, money quietly began shifting into new hands. Here's where things get interesting. The Black Plague was devastating, but it created opportunities for certain groups. Not because they were cruel, not because they exploited suffering, but because the rules of the economy changed overnight. Point 1. The survivors with skills before the plague. Workers were cheap and replaceable. After the plague, labor became extremely valuable. Suddenly, a peasant could walk onto a noble's land and say, "I'll work, but only if you pay me triple." And nobles had no choice. They needed workers to keep their estates running. Wages skyrocketed. Skilled craftsmen demanded more money. Farmhands were treated like prized assets. This was the first time in European history that ordinary workers gained bargaining power. Some peasants did something previously unthinkable. They moved. They left their masters. They negotiated better conditions. Some rented their own land. A few even bought property outright. Generational poverty broke for the first time in centuries. 2. Merchants and traders. When old noble families collapsed, their wealth didn't disappear. Merchants bought land from bankrupt estates at bargain prices. Trade routes shifted. Ports grew rich. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence became financial superpowers. These merchants weren't just selling spices or cloth, they were selling survival. Food, equipment, manpower, transportation, credit. This is where the early banking families of Renaissance Italy expanded their influence. The plague planted the seeds of a new elite, the merchant capitalist class. Point 3. The nobles who adapted. Most nobles suffered, but the clever ones gained even more power. How? They converted farmland into sheep pastures. Sheep required fewer workers, but produced wool, Europe's most valuable export. These nobles became extremely rich by shifting to a more profitable economic model. Crisis didn't destroy them. It forced them to innovate. But not everyone was happy. When peasants earned higher wages and started demanding rights, the ruling class panicked. Governments across Europe responded with what you might call the first anti-worker laws in history. In England, the 1351 Statute of Labourers made it illegal to ask for higher wages. Imagine that, a law forcing you to stay poor after surviving a pandemic. But the law didn't work. Workers ignored it, they moved. They negotiated, they rebelled. And in 1381, the peasants' revolt shook England. This was the moment when the old economic system officially cracked. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed feudalism. The long-term consequences were enormous. The end of serfdom. Serfs slowly transformed into paid workers with mobility and bargaining power. Generations later, feudalism vanished in most of Europe. The birth of the middle-class merchants, craftsmen, and skilled workers accumulated wealth. Cities became financial hubs. Money started mattering more than noble blood. Land redistribution. Dead families left behind property. Survivors inherited huge assets. New landowners emerged from unexpected places. A shift in power. The church lost influence as priests died in huge numbers. Kings centralized power. Nobles rose and fell unpredictably. In short, a medieval pandemic laid the foundations for the modern European economy. But every attempt to control the chaos backfired. Wage caps didn't work. Laws forcing peasants to return to old employers collapsed. Bans on mobility were unenforceable. Religious explanations only increased distrust. Early quarantines caused economic fractures. Governments tried to freeze the old system in place, but the world had already changed. Trying to undo the plague economy was like trying to stop an ocean wave with your bare hands. Here's the twist. The patterns of who gets rich during crises haven't changed. Look at recent history. After the 2008 financial crisis, banks consolidated power. Tech companies exploded. Billionaires multiplied. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while millions lost jobs, global billionaires gained over $3.9 trillion in new wealth. Crises don't create inequality. They accelerate it. Just like the Black Plague, labor shortages shifted power. Governments tried controlling wages. New industries emerged. Old systems collapsed, and wealth moved upward to those positioned to benefit. The same story repeats every time. When the world breaks, someone profits. Crises don't just destroy, they redistribute power. The biggest winners are those already positioned to adapt quickly. Labor becomes powerful when workers become scarce. This was true for medieval peasants, and it's true for modern industries today. Trying to freeze an old system never works. Whether it's feudalism in 1351 or outdated regulations today, economies evolve through disruption, not stability. History's darkest events often create its biggest economic shifts. And every time society rebuilds after a crisis, the rules of wealth change. The question isn't who got rich during the Black Plague. It's who will get rich during the next global crisis, and who will be left behind. If you want more deep dives into the hidden economics behind world-changing events, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Because understanding the past is the only way to see the future coming.